Hi everyone and welcome. What you have here is a tray with some kitchen scraps in it. To be more specific, some of the stuff is clearly identifiable. Got some string beans here, and or green beans, string beans. Maybe it's the same thing. Here we got some cantaloupe rinds, and this stuff really brown and nasty. Some lettuce that had gone bad. And down here we've even got a coffee filter that's got some coffee in it. And in addition to the kitchen scraps, well, these are kitchen scraps too, but one of my standard feeding items here is the coffee grounds in the bottom of this carton box. So these are the things that we're going to use to try to rebuild the feeding zone in my worm bin here. My worm bin, let me get it uncovered here for you. My worm bin, a number of weeks ago, seemed like it was mature enough to the point where we would want to try to start encouraging the worms to begin depopulating the finished castings, which is the material over on this side. And the objective was to try to get them over onto this side of the bin, which is the only place that there's been any food added lately. And it's been 2 weeks now since the last time we checked in on this bin. So we're going to go in here and pull out whatever worms have congregated within the material over the past couple weeks. And we're going to get them into their new home. I've got a new bin, which is only a few weeks old at this point. And it's been the recipient of all the worms that I've been migrating out of all my systems lately. So at the end, we're going to give those worms their freedom again after we pull them out of here. And we're going to position them in their new home over in my newest worm bin. So before we can pull them out, we're going to just start scraping some of this bedding material that sits here on the top of the surface. What we see here is stuff like leaves and leafy materials, various odds and ends, like maybe a banana peel. It's hard to tell, but I believe that that's what a banana peel starts to look like after it's been whittled down by the worms over a period of time. Even this right here, a really paper thin piece of material, is what I believe to be a mango. I think it's the skin of a mango shell or skin or whatever you want to call it. And I believe last time we saw that it still had a little bit of meaty stuff on it, but at this point it's just a paper thin remnant of what it had been in the past. And as we go down, we may see other bits and pieces of the food they'd been given in the past. Certain food items get eaten up pretty quickly, and other food items take a fair amount of time before they're consumed by the worms, depending on a number of different things. Obviously, the material itself being the main variable. So as we start working our way down, we're just trying to pick out some of the stuff that we're going to be able to kind of recycle and reuse, because the assumption right now is that this material might not be fully depopulated yet. There's maybe some worms remaining in here, and if that's the case, then we're going to rebuild the feeding zone over here to try to continue spurring on the movement of the worms out of the finished compost into the feeding area. The feeding area, besides the food, which is meant to lure the worms in, also had that piece of plastic covering it. The plastic's function was to cause the recirculation of any moisture that would be trying to evaporate from the bin, so that it would get captured in the plastic sheet and condense and then be returned down into the bin, as opposed to allowing it to evaporate into the air. This looks like the skin of a cantaloupe, as is that. And just because it remains, it doesn't mean that they're not going to eat it. They're certainly going to eat it. It just takes a little bit more time. And that's the general way to think about it. Certain foods compost quickly, other ones take time. And in the case of a feeding zone like this, I'm learning that it is almost beneficial to have material in here that takes longer to break down, because I believe what I've been seeing lately is that any attempt to migrate worms out of finished castings that I've been doing lately, sometimes the worms just gobble through the material in the feeding zone, and then it is quite possible that they just returned to the comfort of the material that they'd been in previously. Maybe the material in the feeding zone is just not as damp as they prefer, or whatever the case may be. So I really want to try to set up a spot that's going to encourage them to come over, but then also stay. So since our mission here is to extract worms, we're going to be scooping out all the material here in this feeding zone, and it does look like quite a bit. And at this point it also looks like it's primarily castings. So I'm wondering how much other remaining material we're going to find in here. When I built this, I had used a couple pieces of egg carton. So I believe there was a piece here, there was a piece here. So I believe one of the main components of what's in my hand right now is going to be what remains of a piece of egg carton. So I'm going to see if that's another something that we can potentially extract from here and reuse as bedding going forward. Although I'm not sure it's going to remain as a piece of egg carton, but you can already see its basic shape here. And if we're going to try to keep it in the bin for ongoing use, we certainly want to make sure it's been emptied of any worms that might be occupying it. This is pretty cool because the little cups, it is falling apart, so I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to use it going forward. But each of these little cups seems to have gotten loaded with worm castings as the worms make their way into each of these little cups to scoop out whatever delicious food has made its way down into there and dripped into there. They obviously leave behind their castings. So I'm going to keep this over here with the stuff that we're hoping to recycle and reuse when we rebuild the feeding zone. And there again, we haven't really inspected the material at large throughout the bin, so it's not certain yet whether or not we're even going to need to proceed, because the one thing that would tell us we've actually gotten to the finish line of this process is for us to go through here and inspect the rest of this material. If it's already void of any worms and they've all made their way out, then that is in fact a batch of finished vermicompost that we can harvest. So I think before we go nuts and we try to rebuild the feeding zone, I believe we will do a quick inspection to try to figure out if it's even necessary to continue. I have a hunch that it will be necessary to continue, but we'll know when we get in there. During the last check-in of this bin, which was 2 weeks ago now, we did actually skip over an inspection of that material. So it is a little bit of a mystery to me what to expect. I don't know. It's been 2 weeks since the last time we reloaded the feeding zone, and prior to that I believe it had been a week since we had set it up for the migration prior. So the last time we really went in here to inspect this material out here was 3 weeks ago. And it would be nice to think that perhaps the material's been depopulated by now, but you never know. You know, it could take time. It could happen really quickly. I've had occasions where the worms made their way out of the material quite quickly. Then I've got other situations where it takes what seems to be forever. So I think we've managed to skim off a fair bit of material in here. That's certainly stuff we want to leave behind to allow it to continue composting. So let's pile what we've collected up over here and grab another handful. Don't want to run out of room. I believe this middle section is not going to have another cardboard piece, but there will be one over there. In here, if my memory serves me correctly, we've got a mango seed here, which is always a real popular spot. There's always worms hanging out all over it. What I did recently was I put a couple holes to puncture it to enable access to the inside for the worms, and it seems like it's doing the trick, because now I'm actually able to just stick my finger into it and break it up. This is what I find interesting about the mango seeds, is the texture of the material as it breaks down. The mango seed is typically so hard that you can, you know, probably drive a nail with it. It's so hard. But once the worms and all the other microscopic life forms within the bin start working their way through it, it really breaks down nicely. And I think it's the really fine fibers of the husk that the worms enjoy, as well as the inside. Obviously, the inside is where the actual seed is, and that's probably got the greatest amount of nourishment or nourishing materials in it. So I don't think these cups are going to be serving the purpose of a cup anymore going forward. So we've only got one other little batch here, maybe 2 handfuls, I guess, to scoop out. I'm going to try to pull out the other piece of egg carton, although it looks like at this point we've got the whole kit and caboodle, right? Let's see if we're able to isolate that cardboard tray and extract it, because in this one I had actually put a test material into here to see how it progresses, and it was a little batch of human hair, my own human hair, which is it's in one of these 3 cells of the little tray. So I'm going to want to see how that's progressing, although at this point I'm questioning whether I'm going to want to continue tracking it or not, because I do remember somebody chiming in soon after I had initially introduced that into here, stating that human hair does eventually get broken down by the worms, as would fingernails and other stuff like that, but it would take a tremendous amount of time. So it seems like it's just one of those things that you wouldn't want to hold your breath for, and we're not gonna. So we're just gonna maybe take one last look at it and maybe simply mix it in with the rest of the food, and at that point just sort of leave it be and let the worms have at it at their own pace. But we're not going to interest ourselves too much in trying to keep tabs on its progress. As interesting as it would have been, it might have been a thing to put into a much younger bin, perhaps a brand new bin, to see how long it takes. So I'm just bringing this tray back really quick because I am interested in obviously making sure it's not covered in worms, because as you know, we're extracting worms here. That's the mission. So I don't want to leave any behind. I really want them here in my little clear plastic tray. I'd really like to only return materials that are going to help us rebuild the feeding zone. So we've got separate chunks at this point. It seems like this egg carton has disintegrated as the other one did, but we're going to evict all the worms from it before we set it aside, or at least the majority of them if we can, so we can use this material as bedding when we rebuild the feeding zone. Again, I'm just assuming that the feeding zone is going to be rebuilt, so I'm once again just assuming that we're going to have to. So we've got a nice haul. I mean, just from what I can tell so far, it does seem like we've gotten a fair number of worms to make their way over into this feeding zone. I think the last time we did this, I thought that we had estimated that we had extracted something in the neighborhood of something like 400 or 500 worms. I don't recall exactly. And I would think that this could be on par with that. Got to remember, there was an extra week given to this material to get done. So on the last go around, we had done this a week after loading the feeding zone. But in this case, we had actually waited 2 weeks to allow more time for the worms to make their way over. And I think that that's the way to go. As long as there's enough food in the feeding area to continue drawing and interesting the worms to come over, then I think you're in good shape. But if you're very sparing on the food that you place in there, they could very well just come in and deplete whatever food was there and lose interest and leave. And obviously any other worms that would be potentially coming over to enjoy it, they would also have no reason to come over either if all the food was depleted. So now here is the little chunk of hair that I had placed in here, and in previous check-ins I don't recall seeing much activity here, but now it looks like they're finally getting down to business. And it could just be a little bit of a false positive here. It is very possible that maybe some of the food that had been placed right on top of it had simply dripped down, and what they're really after is the drippings that's made its way into the hair. So it's hard to say whether it's the hair that they're eating and being attracted to, or just the residual drop off of the material that had been placed on top of it. But you know, it is an interesting thing, and it would be fun to watch it further progress. But I think it would be better to repeat this test later in a more controlled environment, because we are really driving towards completion of this bin's life cycle, hopefully winding things down to the point where we can harvest the castings. And who knows, this could very well be the last extraction of worms from this tray. Maybe we are done. We don't know until we actually check the material underneath. So I'm going to set this stuff aside right here. And the light overhead should actually, you know, cause the worms near the top of the surface to want to dive down and retreat from the bright light. And then perhaps we can actually extract a little bit more of this material off the top and recycle it and reuse it in the feeding zone. So let's give this stuff a little bit of time, and we'll get back to it in a few minutes. In the meantime, we do have a couple tasks at hand over here in the main section of the bin where the finished compost is. So I'm just going to take away all these things that we pulled out previously. That'll afford us the opportunity to better inspect how things are progressing over here. That was always the place where I had placed the the hair in the past, so I don't know, who knows, maybe I'll just end up leaving it right there so that in the future check-ins we still have a chance to see how it's progressing, but I'm not going to go out of my way at this point anymore to keep tabs on that. I'll just treat that as a test that started but never really completed. And this stuff over here that had been used previously to cover things up, I think it's really not going to serve that purpose very well anymore because it's just tattered. The worms love paper. It too is a perfectly suitable food source. And if the food that you're giving them, such as kitchen scraps, is a very nitrogen-rich type food, then the worms could very well be looking for something to help balance that out. So the balance that you get is the carbon-rich materials. So the worms do rely on not only having a nitrogen food source, but a carbon food source as well. I don't know if there's some sort of a ratio to it. I know in regular outdoor composting there is sort of, I think it's a 30-to-1 ratio of only 1 part nitrogen is needed to 30 parts carbon or something like that. There again, I could be wrong. I'm just going off the top of my head on stuff like that, and I don't really do much outdoor composting. But I believe that ratio doesn't really apply so much in the worm world. To them, it's just food. And I've actually done tests where the worms were given only carbon for many, many months on end, and they'll survive off that, and they'll do just fine. But I do have a sense that they do thrive on a pretty good variety. Alright, so one thing we're noticing here right on the perimeter of the feeding zone is that we do have a fair number of worms, and that just could be because we, you know, decided to cut it off at a certain point. Perhaps if we had gone with a slightly different position to check differently, then maybe we would have gotten different results. So let's treat this first little chunk of material. It's pretty damp, I guess, but let's treat that as what we know to be fairly densely populated with worms still. Let's start inspecting the rest of this material to see how the migration is progressing. Here too, especially down at the bottom where there tends to be a collection of moisture in most cases, especially now when the evaporation of the moisture in the bin slows down greatly because of the humidity in the air. We've got a good amount of moisture in here, and I believe that that's one of the key things that's preventing the worms from wanting to leave. Because the damp conditions are making it into a nice cozy spot for them to hang out in, not really inspiring them to exit very quickly. So you can see that pretty much everywhere we look, even at the far reaches of the bin, we've got pretty much the same conditions going on. Even though the whole bin was covered with only paper to try to promote evaporation, it really hasn't happened much here. And that could also be because last time we checked in here 2 weeks ago, we did not do an inspection of this material, so we did not try jostling up the more moist stuff and pushing down the more dry stuff. We just kind of did an extraction of worms and a reset of the baiting area, and we sort of skipped an inspection of the material. But I believe that this inspection does reveal to us that this material is not quite harvest ready. It's definitely still pretty heavily populated. So it's going to have to continue, and I think I'm going to take this really damp stuff that was adjacent to our feeding zone, and I'm going to try to blend it in over here, because it does seem to be the most damp of the material. So if we can combine it with some slightly drier material, maybe it'll all equalize and have a sort of common moisture level. But I am sensing that we might be best off potentially leaving this bin uncovered to allow for the moisture to evaporate more readily. So let's just get back on track here with rebuilding the feeding zone, because it will be necessary at this point to allow this process to continue. And it's hard to say how much longer it's going to take. I don't think I'm in a real hurry to have it happen. So we can certainly let it ride and run its course naturally. The overall age of this bin at this point is 161 days, which equates to precisely 23 weeks. And I believe if we had maybe started a little bit earlier with trying to let the material start drying out, then it might have become a little bit less hospitable, maybe a little bit less cozy for the worms, and it could have potentially spurred on their migration a little bit better. But at this point, with the summer months here and the high humidity, it seems like this material is staying pretty cozy and comfy for them, and they're not really inspired to exit so quickly. But the stuff definitely looks nice. I'd love to see how it would look if it were a little bit drier. I'd love to see it a little bit more crumbly. But it is what it is. So we're going to move on at this point and start rebuilding our migration zone. Really quickly though, I'm just going to sort of set that pile of hair right there in the corner and leave it be. And I do remember now from the last feeding, even though it was 2 weeks ago, I do remember there was a big pile of watermelon right there and right there, both corners. We had a pretty good amount of watermelon in there to try to draw the attention of the worms. So that that could be part of the reason there was a whole bunch of worms over the hair, because of the watermelon juices that had dripped down into it. So let's figure out what to do next here. The level overall almost seems consistent throughout, but if we start piling in all kinds of fresh food here, we're going to end up with this huge feeding zone. It makes me wonder if that's really what we're after. I do like the idea of this being spread out quite nicely to encourage evaporation. So I don't know if I would want to try to push it back and make it higher. I think I will just leave it as is, and we're just going to proceed with trying to build up this feeding zone to make it into a nice, appealing place that the worms will want to come to. I had thought about going ahead and placing a bed of fresh dry leaves in here as a fresh layer of bedding, but I believe that we're in pretty good shape. All that stuff that we placed in there is more or less all cardboard and leaves, all good bedding materials to use in your worm bins. So I think from a bedding perspective, we are in pretty good shape, so we don't need more, because that would just lift up the overall level in there. And I would like to somehow, if possible, end up with a somewhat level overall top surface throughout the bin. So I like to try to use that as a gauge if possible to see how things are progressing in terms of how much it has dropped, indicating whether or not the worms have been consuming what's in there. So a lot of times I'll be attempting to level things off just to use it as a gauge. And that looks pretty decent. That is kind of what we were after. And let's not forget that we've also got a bunch of stuff here that we thought we might still be able to reuse too. So we know that the worms have probably been diving down into this material in pursuit of safety away from the bright lights. So any of the material sitting here on the top, I think, is fair game to go right back down into the feeding zone. Most of it is, from what I could tell, just from touching it, it's mainly castings, but that's fine. I don't mind. It is pretty rich, I think, in edible materials, or at least I would hope it is. It seems to be. It also has scattered bits of bedding throughout it, which is also good. Even though it is a wormery and it's, you know, nothing special, I do want to, if possible, avoid creating something that's going to attract tons and tons of insects. So it's for that reason that I am typically, you know, pretty interested in making sure that my feeding zones are pretty nicely covered, because you know, I'm using stuff like melon and different things that are probably going to, you know, easily draw flying insects if they sense it. So I like to try to cover things up pretty thoroughly if I can. So I believe that in addition to this reclaimed stuff that I'm putting back in, I've also got a little bit of coffee that I'd like to sprinkle over the top, which may or may not serve the purpose that I'm using it for, which is kind of a scent barrier. So I'm kind of hoping that it does in fact serve that purpose. Besides being food, I like to try to suppress the smell of the food underneath by covering it with the coffee. I'm gradually working my way down to where the worms are, I think. Every time I skim some stuff off, I try to see if there's any worms coming along for the ride. And for the most part, it looks like we're doing a good job of excluding them. It's kind of a cool tendency of the worms to try to dive down, get out of the view of the bright light overhead. And in the end, if you're lucky, you just end up with a pretty neatly separated pile of worms on the bottom and other stuff that you've removed from the top. You can see I'm not going out of my mind trying to separate them perfectly. I'm really just after some sort of a way to better sense how many worms there are in here, and it's always easiest when they're not commingled with a bunch of material surrounding them. If you can actually see the worms, then you can visually try to get a sense of how many of them there are. And in the past, I've been actually placing my loads of extracted worms onto the scale to try to weigh them, and then using the calculation that says that 1,000 worms amounts to approximately 1 pound of weight. So I usually try to use that as a way to gauge how many worms it is that I've got in my hand. So whether or not we're going to weigh these guys today or not is still uncertain. More recently, I've been just trying to guess how many worms I've got just by looking at them, and by also asking people in the viewing audience to give me their thoughts on how many they think they see there. So I think I'm going to take that route today too and just skip the weighing of the worms. But who knows, maybe when we get a little bit closer, if it looks like we got a lot and we're really curious to know how many we have, maybe we will just get the scale out really quickly and check how many we have. So let me set these little guys aside for another minute or two and give them time again to drive themselves down into the material to escape from the overhead lights. All right, and then we'll go ahead and we'll cover up with the coffee. But you know, before we do that, Another thing I like to try to include in my feedings is grit. In my case, the grit is pulverized eggshell. And the grit's a key feature to the worm's diet because it is vital to their digestive system. Without it, they would have a hard time breaking down the foods that they eat. So I'm using it plentifully in our feeding zone. And then we'll go ahead and apply the little bit of coffee that I have here. I believe that's pretty much all the used coffee I have in the house right now. I've been tending to my bins over the past couple days pretty regularly, and I've tapped out my supply of used coffee for the most part. But if in fact coffee does actually suppress the smell of the fruit that lies beneath, then hopefully it'll serve the purpose of keeping the bugs away. So now I'm actually going to take a break, turn the camera off for a moment or two, and let these worms dive further down in the hopes that we can hopefully, pull some more of the material off the top that they're hiding underneath, so that we can return it to the feeding zone and maybe end up with just a little bit of a worm ball underneath. And in the meantime, I'll just start taking care of some of the stuff that we're done using around here, a little bit of proactive cleaning up. So I think it's break time. I will return. So now off camera, I've been steadily picking off bits and pieces of this uncomposted material that we hauled out of the feeding zone, attempting to return it to the feeding zone and recycle it. But as I make my way down, you can see there's always little chunks that are very damp and are occupied by a number of very, very small worms. And I'm not letting that deter me. I know that I'm returning a number of worms that we've at this point technically hauled out, and we've come this close to migrating them to their new home. But I guess my interest in seeing how many worms I was able to collect sort of outweighs the negative side of returning them into action in the old bin. It's not the end of the world either way. Either way, it'll eventually all come out in the wash. And maybe at some point we can just sort of take this material as being the entire load to be relocated, but try to give it sort of a, some sort of an inspection, so it would permit us the opportunity to try to come up with an estimate of, hey, how much of it is actually worms and how much of it is not, so that we can try to guesstimate a number here. Once again, I'm just going to shut the camera off, give this material a little bit more time for the worms to dive down out of it, down to the bottom, which is where we want them to be. You can already see hints of what's happening, right? You pull some of this stuff off to the side, and that's what we're after. We just want to see the worm ball, right? We'd like to see just a big bunch of worms hanging out and have their surrounding material pulled aside or pulled off so we can see them. So maybe one more little short break here. Let the worms that are still at the top make their way down. If I can easily pick off a few more handfuls of this stuff, then so be it. But we'll see if we can, at that point, come up with some sort of a rough estimate of how many worms it is that we're relocating. Okay. So I will be back. So it's been a few more minutes, and I'm only going to pick off a few more pieces of this stuff. I'll show you how I'm coming along here. It's becoming more and more difficult to distinguish between where the worms are and where the other stuff is, because when you get to a nice gooey chunk of this stuff, it's pretty much a combination of worms and the stuff that they're occupying. And as long as they're, nested within something like that, they're not even going to see the light or sense the light that's intended to drive them away. So to expect them to evacuate every little chunk is unrealistic. I believe that for that reason now I'm simply going to skim off a few last larger chunks, and then maybe we can sort of come up with some sort of a rough ratio of, how much of this is worms and how much of this is other, so that we can try to arrive at some sort of an estimate of how many worms we're hauling out on this run. So like this is kind of what you're after, is you just skim off a large chunk of stuff and this large worm ball remains beneath. That's really kind of what I was after, but I did hope that when you skim off a chunk of this stuff that it would come off worm free. But it's just the nature of this really damp stuff and gooey stuff that it's going to be it's just going to be full of little baby worms living inside of it. And you know, they're not even going to sense that there's light overhead that they should be trying to flee from. They're going to just be fine in there, because as far as they're concerned, they're still in darkness. So why don't we stop returning all of these worms at this point back into the composting bin. Let's consider this as our extraction. These are the worms that are getting relocated into the newest of my bins. And I've kind of stopped weighing them. I've just resorted back to trying to come up with just rough thumbnail estimates of how many worms I believe are here. So if you're out there and you think you've got an estimate or a guess as to what we've got here in terms of number of worms, I'd appreciate it. I'm trying to handle it in such a way that we can get a better reference to its amount relative to the size of my hand. And I guess the other thing that might be an easy thing to equate it to is something very similar to this, which I like to consider as the hamburger patty comparison. So I mean, if I was in the process of forming a hamburger for somebody to throw onto the barbecue, then what size burger is this? Is this a quarter pounder? Is it smaller? I would probably guess that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about a quarter pound. But you've also got to factor in that this is not purely worms. There's still a bunch of compost in here, commingled with the worms. So maybe a quarter pound. Maybe we'll just be liberal and overestimate a little bit, and we'll call it a quarter pound. How does that sound? In terms of quantities, I'm just going to use pounds and ounces. Sorry to those of you who think metric. So I think the commonly believed quantity of worms that you would equate to 1 pound of worms is 1,000. So if what we're talking about here in rough numbers is a quarter pound, then this might be 250 worms or thereabouts. Maybe if it's less, we call it 200, right? So let's call it that. Let's consider this as another extraction of worms that amounts to 200 in quantity. And they're going to be relocated into the newest of my bins, which has been the beneficiary of all of my recent worm extractions from all of my mature worm bins. And last time I estimated it, I had already exceeded the amount of, I think I'm somewhere over 4,000. And I got a feeling that this is going to push us up to the approximately 4,500 range in that new bin, which is pretty awesome. It's going to be a hungry bin, that's for sure. So let's get things over here covered back up so we can proceed to the releasing of our worms. So I believe in the interest of trying to let things in this bin start drying off a little bit, I believe what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave off the bubble wrap that had been there previously, covering up the feeding zone to promote recirculation of moisture. And I believe I'm just going to, maybe we'll just do half of it. I'm just going to use just this paper at this point to cover up the feeding zone, which might provide a mild amount of protection to ward off the evaporation of the moisture beneath it, but certainly not much. And I think maybe I'll leave this uncovered to try to promote evaporation. It may not last. A lot of times I come down into the wormery and I'm just not comfortable with this being completely exposed. So I might end up losing my nerve and coming back and covering this up with paper in the end. But for now, let's try it this way. We're going to set this aside and let it continue, maybe another 2 weeks again, you know? See how we do in terms of migrating our worms over. So that's where we stand now with our 23-week-old worm bin. making pretty nice progress. My only complaint would be the excess moisture, but that's par for the course in the summer months, at least where I live. So let's move on to releasing our worm haul. So now this is the same bin into which we had released our worms previously. It's the newest of my bins. At this stage, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 3 to 4 weeks of age. Like I said earlier, numerous bins that I'm trying to wind down and bring closure to have been donors of worm population into this bin. And the numbers keep mounting. And if my estimates are correct, then we're already in excess of 4,000 worms in here, which is a pretty large population of worms. So my main concern is going to be making sure that they're continuously well fed. And it was yesterday that I had already placed a nice big load of food right down the middle for them. And that should really be appreciated by our worms when we put them there, because they can just jump right down into this material and find a whole bunch of food and have a big feast, welcome party into their new home. So here we go. One more guess. What do we think? 200 worms? 300 worms? It's hard to say. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that, so please put them in the comments and let me know what you think. And then I'll try to update my records by averaging out my own estimate and everyone else's guesstimates. So let's get these guys released into their new home. I try to spread them out so that they've all got easy access to the material beneath them. It should help speed up their vanishing act. Okay. Go, guys. Dive. For the most part, I believe they've all withdrawn down into the material, made themselves at home, and that couldn't have been more than a couple minutes, so that happened pretty quickly. So that's pretty cool. So that's all we were looking to do today. I guess there's still one thing remaining in here, which we did not utilize yet, which is the coffee filter. A lot of times I use these out of my little collection of dry and clean coffee filters, but this one is still covered in coffee, and that's perfectly fine. We're just going to throw it right here on top of where we know the feeding zone is, because I traditionally like to mark where I have last fed. So now our bin actually has a feeding zone marker as well, in the form of a coffee filter. Alright, so there's only a little bit more cleanup to do, because in the short segments between the clips, I've been running off to the sink to rinse stuff off and put things away. But cleaning things up and putting things away is boring, so I won't keep you around for that. I'll just take this as a quick opportunity before I go to say thank you. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and if you did, as always, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up, show that you liked the video. It means a lot, and I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate it if you consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.